Alpec. And if you are someone who needs to leave early for any reason, part of that group that tends to leave, you might go ahead and consider leaving at that time and streaming it at your convenience. There's a link for this posted to Canvas. There's a module for section 2 presentations, and you can go in there, and there is a single slide with the link to the stream this video. Okay? Yeah. This video will be covered on exam 2. I wouldn't take class time to show it if I didn't think it was really valuable information, right? So, but the fact that you stream it through Alpec means you can go back and review it anytime you want, right? Okay, so we were discussing how early anthropologists were concerned with the idea of race and the negative impact it was having on, at that time, in the early 20th century, European immigrants, as well as in the early 20th century, we have basically institutionalized racism against people of African descent, American Indian descent, and you go west and you get people of Asian descent who had come in to work in the mines and the railroads and all sorts of things. So anybody basically of non-European ancestry or who couldn't essentially pass themselves off as being white was subject to different forms of discrimination, right? So Franz Boas was an anthropologist at Columbia University, and he was actually sort of a classically trained anthropologist. He did cultural anthropology, he did biological anthropology at the time, and he took, as I mentioned, anthropometric measurements, the living measurements of immigrants, first people who've immigrated over from Europe, as well as their children who've grown up here in the U.S. So these people from the late 19th and early 20th century. In 1911, he published on that. He was primarily doing this because there was legislation being discussed to limit immigration from places like Ireland, from places like southern Italy, and limitations on Jewish immigrants because they were considered to be not white. Right? So we have to remember, we often think of European ancestry or light skin equaling white, but there have been times in history when whiteness has been defined as something else than just geography and skin color, even though for the definers, people saying, I am white and you are not, oftentimes what they use is skin color, geography, and we have religion and culture. Right? Plus historical issues, like historical issues that the British had with the Irish. Right? So you end up with this research where Boas demonstrates significant differences in body form and shape between the parent generation who grew up in Europe, generally in poor environments, moves to the United States, had children born in the United States that then grew up in the United States. Significant differences across the generations. And he attributed those differences to environmental differences, the improved environment in the U.S. relative to where they came from. The small villages, the tightly packed tenant buildings that they lived in, or apartment-like buildings in big cities, things of that nature. And so this is, again, that idea of phenotypic plasticity. There can be change in the phenotype without a significant change in genotypes, because you're going from parent to child, right? Another amazing thing about Boas is he did statistics on thousands of individuals. He had thousands of individuals in his study, and he calculated means and standard deviations and basically did t-tests looking at the differences between one generation and the next, and to see if what he saw as differences in the means were real differences, statistically significant, with pencil and paper. There were no calculators, let alone anything else. So he was doing very sophisticated work longhand. We've more recently had research, so with the start of the genomic age, early geneticists like Lewontin in 1972 picked 17 genetic traits. So this time, they were only basically able to identify specific parts, like blood type ABO, RH blood type, MN blood type, and sequence the alleles for those particular genetic traits. These are very simple genetic traits, 1972, 17 different traits, and 7 geographic regions. And these geographic regions roughly correspond to areas that people have considered to be associated with the different races. Remember, skin color and geographic origin are what have been typically used to define race, although not exclusively, right? So we have sub-Saharan Africans, Asians, South Asians. So there's Lewontin's recognizing a distinction between Northeast, East Asian, and Southeast Asians. American Indians, so that's North and South America. Oceanians, which we would now call Pacific Islanders, and Australians. I edited this, and I guess I didn't upload it. And of course, I forgot Europeans in this list, and Europeans. Right? So what he found in 1972 is that of the genetic variation across these 17 markers, 85% of that variation exists within each of these groups. Within the Europeans from Europe, within the North and East Asians, within sub-Saharan Africa, within the Americas. And that only 15% of the variation, taking all the variation that exists across those traits, only 15% was between groups. So between Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans, between sub-Saharan Africans and Southeast Asians, so on and so forth. So what this means is that most geographic variation, genetic variation among these groups is within each group. The vast majority of genetic variation exists within the groups, with a minimal amount, about 15%, between the groups, which argues against the idea that there are discrete genetic groups for each geographic region. Yes?
I don't know if you heard this, but where would you classify people from the Middle East and whatnot?
Either in Europe or Asia. Mm-hmm. And he asked about people from like the Middle East or North Africa, and I said either with Europe or Asia. I'm not sure which he specifically did. I do know that studies that when they include places like Egypt, then you tend to find that Egypt almost centers Europe, Asia, and Africa, because it was a crossroads for those three continents for so very long, thousands of years, going back to before the Silk Road period even. So what this means is most human genetic variation is at the individual level. It is not between groups. It does not distinguish groups from one another. Genetic variation is really between people from the same geographic region. Now, more recent genetic studies where they've looked genomic work has come a long way since the 70s. And now they've sequenced the entire human genome. And looking at genetic variation worldwide, we see patterns where anywhere from 83 to 97% of the genetic variation is within a geographic group. And conversely, 17 to 3% exists between. And this just depends on which parts of the human genome that you're looking at. That's where we get these ranges. Again, same pattern. The vast majority of human genetic variation exists within major geographic regions. There's a very small amount of genetic variation that exists between those geographic regions. So that means most genetic variation is between individuals. It's at the individual level. Right? We talked at the beginning of the semester about how we're unique genetic beings, and that is where the genetic variation exists, at the individual level. Studies have also been done looking at biological traits. So anthropologists, unfortunately, except for people like Franz Boas, Ashley Montague, early 20th century researchers along those lines, most anthropologists bought into the idea of race, because it's like they seem to perceive it as a neat and tidy way to divide the human species up and to characterize human variation. So they did study. And one of the most popular types of studies is cranial variation, looking at the size and shape of the cranium. And we noticed that there are facial features that there's variation in worldwide, and the idea is that you could capture this. Okay? There are also studies looking at blood groups, any type of trait you can think of. Anthropologists try to use it to create a racial hierarchy or classification scheme. In the 1990s, we get research, 1990s, early 2000s, where people have built databases with enough individuals in them that you can look at variation in cranial morphology worldwide, sort of emulate the setup of the genetic studies, right? Where you're looking at these major geographic regions. And what they find is that about 87% of the variation in craniofacial morphology, or the phenotype, exists within major geographical regions. That maps right on to what we know from the genetic data. And that about 13% of the variation exists between major geographic regions. Again, patterning or mapping very nicely with the genetic data. Okay? So this tells us what we see with our eyes when we look at faces, and we think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of variation. And there is variation, but it is not nearly as significant or to the degree that we think it is. There's no one group that has a particular trait that's only found in that group and cannot be found in any other. Human variation is continuous. Any effort to divide it up into discrete groups is necessarily arbitrary in nature. Whoever is making those lines, creating those cubby holes to put groups in, they're defining what belongs to that group. And it differs from person to person to person. Nobody can agree because there is no set of features that everybody can run the same experiment and get the same results, except for studies like this that show that the vast majority of human variation is within groups, so between individuals, so between Carson and me, and between me and Kaylin and Carson. That's where the genetic variation is, at the individual level. there's only a minimal amount of genetic variation between these major geographic groups. So that means race as a biological concept doesn't hold water. Doesn't hold water. And then that brings us back to, you're probably going, well, what about, remember we talked about skin color, right? We talked about skin color. Well, obviously, there's some variation when it comes to skin color worldwide, right? And as you saw in the video, this variation is due to variation in the levels of eumelanin in the skin, which is the product of variation in genes, right? There's genetic variation that controls this pattern of skin color in indigenous populations around the world, or the skin color that you inherit from your parents, the genes that you inherit from your parents. But what is this pattern reflecting? What? I just couldn't hear. No. What has created this pattern? The what? Yes. Intensity of UV radiation. And the intensity of UV radiation is a selective force. So this pattern is a product of natural selection. This UV pattern is a product of natural selection. This is one of the few areas where we see significant genetic variation across geographic groups. And actually, one of the studies I showed you about cranial diversity, he compared cranial diversity to skin color and found the exact opposite patterns. Because this is under significant, strong genetic control because of natural selection. Whereas other patterns of genetic diversity, including craniofacial diversity, are more a product of gene flow and genetic drift. Gene flow and genetic drift. Right? So there's very little genetic variation in the human species. Very little. But what variation there is primarily the product of natural selection operating on a very young species, which is what we are. Right? So I am going to now shift over and start the video. Right? It is about 58 minutes, so we probably won't get through all of it. Just say